everyone and welcome to today's lecture. Today we are going to talk about concept of coping, ways of coping and stress management. The objectives of my topic are understanding the background of stress, to understand concept of coping, understanding the strategies of coping, understand how stress works and develop sustainable behaviors, to get familiar with the concept of stress management, develop personal resources in stress overdraft, develop a personal action plan for stress management. Now, before discussing the topic, it is very important that we understand the meaning and the nature of stress. When you hear people say that they are under a lot of stress, you have some idea about what they mean. Usually, the statement means that they feel unable to deal with the demands of their environment and they feel tense and uncomfortable. Because of the pervasiveness and the commonality of these experiences in our lives, you might expect that defining the concept of stress would be simple, but it isn't. Let us see how psychologists have conceptualized stress and what the prevailing definition is today. The condition of stress has two components: physical, involving direct material or bodily challenge, and psychological, involving how individuals perceive circumstances in their lives. These components can be examined in three ways. One approach focuses on the environment. Stress is seen as a stimulus, as when we have a demanding job or experience severe pain from arthritis or a death in the family. Physically or psychologically challenging events or circumstances are called stressors. The second approach treats stress as a response, focusing on people's reactions to stressors. When we see an example of this approach, when people use the word stress to refer to their state of tension. Our responses can be psychological, such as your thought patterns and emotions when you feel nervous, and psychological, as when your heart pounds, your mouth goes dry, and you perspire. The psychological and physiological responses to a stressor is called strain. Now, coming to the third approach. The third approach describes stress as a process that includes stressors and strains, but adds an important dimension: the relationship between the person and the environment. This process involves continuous interactions and adjustments called transactions with the person and the environment, each affecting and being affected by the other. According to this view, stress is not just a stimulus or a response, but rather a process in which the person is an active agent who can influence the impact of a stressor through behavioral, cognitive, and emotional strategies. People differ in the amount of the strain they experience from the same stressor. One person who is stuck in a traffic and late for an important appointment keeps looking at his watch, honking his horn and getting angrier by the minute. Another person in the same circumstances stays calm, turns on the radio and listens to music. We will define stress as a circumstance in which transactions lead a person to perceive a discrepancy between the physical or psychological demands of a situation and the resources of his or her biological, psychological or social systems. An important point to keep in mind is that a demand resource or discrepancy may be either real or just believed to exist. As an example, suppose you had to take an exam and wanted to do well but worried greatly that you would not. If you had procrastinated and did not prepare for the test, the discrepancy you see between the demands and your resources might be real. But if you had previously done well on similar exams, prepared thoroughly for this one and scored well on a pre-test in a study guide, yet still thought you would not do well, the discrepancy you see would not reflect the true state of affairs. Stress often results from inaccurate perceptions of discrepancies between environmental demands and the actual resources. Stress in the eye of the beholder. Individuals of all ages experience stress and try to deal with it. During childhood years, people learn ways to manage feelings of stress that arise from many fearful situations they experience. For instance, psychologist Lois Murphy has described the progress and setbacks as 4-year-old named Molly had made in dealing with the terror she felt during thunderstorms. In last steps at gaining control over her fear, she experienced 2 storms a few months apart. During the first storm, she awoke and didn't cry, but I just snuggled in my bed, she said later. In the second storm, she showed up outward fair and comforted her frightened brother, saying, I remember when I was a little baby and I was scared of thunder and I used to cry and cry every time it thundered. Like Molly, most children became better able to cope with the stress of storms as she grew older. Now, what's more, in the last steps of her progress, she showed pride in having mastered her fear. Because the emotional and the physical strain that accompanies stress is uncomfortable, people are motivated to do things to reduce their stress. These things are what is involved in coping. So, what is coping? Several definitions of coping exist. We will use a definition based on how we defined stress earlier when we saw that stress involves perceived discrepancy between the demands of the situation and the resources of the person. Coping is the process by which people try to manage the perceived discrepancy between the demands and resources they appraise in a stressful situation. Notice the word manage in this definition. It indicates that coping efforts can be quite varied and do not necessarily lead to a solution of the problem. Although coping efforts can be aimed at correcting or mastering the problem, they may also simply help the person alter his or her perception of discrepancy, tolerate or accept the harm or threat, or escape to avoid the situation. For example, a child who faces a stressful exam in school might cope by feeling nauseated and staying home. We cope with stress through our cognitive and behavioral transactions with the environment. Suppose you are overweight and smoke cigarettes, and your physician has asked you to lose weight and stop smoking because several factors place you at high risk for developing heart disease. This presents a threat. You may become disabled or die, and is stressful, especially if you do not think you can change your behavior. How might you cope with this? Some people would cope by seeking information about ways to improve their ability to change. Other people would simply find another doctor who is not so directive. Others would attribute their health to fate or the will of God and leave the problem in His hands. Still, others would try to deaden this and other worries with alcohol, which would add to the risk. People use many different methods to try to manage the appraised discrepancy between the demands of the situation and their resources. The coping process is not a single event because coping involves continuous transactions with the environment. The process is best viewed as a dynamic series of appraisals and reappraisals that adjust to shifts in the person-environment relationships. And so, in coping with the threat of serious illness, people who try to change their lifestyles may receive encouragement and better relationships with their physician and family. But individuals who ignore the problem are likely to experience worse and worse health relations with these people. Each shift in one direction or the other is affected by transactions that preceded it and affect subsequent transactions. Now let us discuss ways of coping. You have probably realized by now that people have many ways for coping with the stress. Because of this, researchers have attempted to organize coping approaches on the basis of their functions and the methods they employ. Researchers have described different types of coping. Some differentiate between approach and avoidance coping, while others describe emotion-focused and problem-focused coping. Approach versus avoidance. Roth and Cohen in 1986 defined two basic modes of coping, approach and avoidance. Approach coping involves confronting the problem, gathering information and taking direct action. In contrast, avoidant coping involves minimizing the importance of the event. People tend to show one form of coping or the other, although it is not possible for someone to manage one type of problem by denying it and another by making specific plans. Some researchers have argued that approach coping is consistently more adaptive than avoidant coping. However, research indicates that the effectiveness of coping style depends upon the nature of the stressor. For example, avoidant coping might be more effective for the short-term stressors but less effective for the longer-term stressors. Therefore, it might be best to avoid thinking about one-off stressor such as going to the dentist but make plans and attend to a longer-term stressor such as marital conflict. According to Richard Lazarus and his colleagues, coping can serve two main functions. It can alter the problem causing the stressor, it can regulate the emotional response to the problem. Now, emotion-focused coping is aimed at controlling the emotional response to the stressful situation. People can regulate their emotional responses through behavioral and cognitive approaches. Examples of behavioral approaches include using alcohol or drugs, seeking emotional social support from friends or relatives, and engaging in activities such as sports or watching TV, which distract attention from the problem. Cognitive approaches involve how people think about the stressful situation. In one cognitive approach, people redefine the situation to put a good face on it, such as by noting that the things could be worse, making comparisons with individuals who are less well off, or seeing something good growing out of the problem. People who want to redefine a stressful situation can generally find a way to do it, since there is almost always some aspect of one's life that can be viewed positively. Other emotion-focused cognitive processes include strategies, Freud called defense mechanisms, which involve distorting memory or reality in some way. For instance, when something is too painful to face, the person may deny that it exists. This defense mechanism is called denial. In medical situations, the individuals who are diagnosed with terminal diseases often use this strategy and refuse to believe they are really ill. This is one way by which people cope by using avoidance strategies. But strategies that promote avoidance of the problem are helpful mainly in the short run, such as during early stage of a prolonged stress experience. This is so for individuals who are diagnosed with serious illness. For instance, as a rule of the thumb, the effectiveness of avoidance promoting methods seems to be limited to the first couple of weeks of a prolonged stress experience. Thereafter, coping is better served by giving the situation attention. People tend to use emotion-focused approaches when they believe they can do little to change the stressful conditions. An example of this is when a loved one dies. In this situation, people often seek emotional support and distract themselves with the funeral arrangements and chores at home or at work. Other examples can be seen in situations in which individuals believe their resources are and cannot be adequate to meet the demands of the stressor. A child who tries very hard to be the straight A student in his or her parents seem to want but never succeeds may reappraise the situation and decide, I don't need their love. Coping methods that focus on emotions are important because they sometimes interfere with getting medical treatment or involve unhealthy behaviors, such as using cigarettes, alcohol, and drugs to reduce tension. People often use the substances in their efforts toward the emotion-focused coping. Problem-focused coping is aimed at reducing the demands of a stressful situation or expanding the resources to deal with it. Everyday life provides many examples of problem-focused coping, including quitting a stressful job, negotiating an extension for paying some bills, devising a new schedule for studying, choosing a different career to pursue, seeking medical or psychological treatment, and learning new skills. People tend to use problem-focused approach when they believe their resources or the demands of the situation are changeable. For example, caregivers of terminally ill patients use problem-focused coping more in the months prior to the death than their bereavement. Several factors have been shown to influence which coping strategies used. Let us discuss them one by one. Type of problem. Work problems seem to evoke more problem-focused coping, whereas health and relationship problems tend to evoke emotion-focused coping. Age. Children tend to use more problem-focused coping strategies, whereas emotion-focused strategies seem to develop in adolescence. Folkman reported that middle-aged men and women tended to use problem-focused coping, whereas elderly used emotion-focused coping. Gender. It is generally believed that women use more emotion-focused coping than men are more problem-focused. Controllability. People tend to use problem-focused coping if they believe that the problem itself can be changed. In contrast, they use more emotion-focused coping if the problem is perceived as being out of their control. Available resources. Coping is influenced by external resources such as time, money, children, family, and education. Poor resources may make people feel that the stressor is less controllable by them, resulting in a tendency not to use problem-focused coping. Now coming to the next portion, that is stress management. Many people have difficulty in managing stress themselves. Accordingly, health psychologists have increasingly turned their attention to developing techniques of stress management. Who participates in stress management programs? Some people obtain help in stress management through private therapists in one-to-one psychotherapeutic experience. More commonly, stress management is taught through workshops, sometimes in the workplace. Basic techniques of stress management can also help people reduce their risk of illness, ranging from tension, headaches to heart diseases. Now, basic techniques of stress management. Stress management programs typically involve 3 phases. In the first phase, participants learn what stress is and how to identify the stressors in their own lives. In the second phase, they acquire and practice skills for coping with stress. In the final phase, they practice these stress management techniques in targeted stressful situations and monitor their effectiveness. As an example, college can be an extremely stressful experience for many new students. For some, it is their first time away from home and they must cope with living in a dormitory surrounded by strangers. They may have to share a room with another person from a very different background and with very different personal habits. High noise levels, communal bathrooms, institutional food, and rigorous academic schedules may all be trying experiences for new students. Academic life may prove to be more difficult than they had expected, and if they see little prospect for improvement, they may become increasingly anxious, find that the college environment is too stressful, and drop out. Recognizing that these pressures exist, college administrators have increasingly made stress management programs available to their students. A stress management program. An example of a program called Combat Stress Now, that is CSN, make use of these various phases of education, skill, acquisition, and practice. Identifying stressors. In the first phase of the CSN program, participants learn what stress is and how it creates physical wear and tear. In sharing their personal experience of stress, many students find reassurance in the fact that so many other students have experiences similar to their own. They learn that stress is a process of psychological appraisal rather than a factor inherent in the events themselves. Thus, college life is not inherently stressful but is a consequence of the individual's perceptions of it. Through these messages, the students begin to see that if they are armed with appropriate stress management techniques, they will come to experience currently stressful events as less stressful. Monitoring stress. In self-monitoring phase of CSN program, students are trained to observe their own behavior closely and to record the circumstances that they find most stressful. In addition, they record their physical, emotional and behavioral reactions to those stresses as they experience them. Students also record their own maladaptive efforts to cope with these stressful events, including excessive sleeping or eating, television watching and alcohol consumption. Identifying stress antecedents. Once students learn to chart their stress responses, they are encouraged to examine the antecedents of these experiences. They learn to focus on what events happen just before they experience feelings of the stress. For example, one student may feel overwhelmed with academic life only when contemplating having to speak out in the class, whereas another student may experience stress primarily when thinking about having to use a computer in a particularly demanding course. Thus, by pinpointing exactly those circumstances that initiate feelings of stress, students can more precisely identify their own trouble spots. Avoiding negative self-talk. Students are next trained to recognize and eliminate the negative self-talk they go through when they face stressful events. Negative self-talk can contribute to irrational feelings that perpetuate stress. For example, the student who fears speaking out in class may recognize how self-statements contribute to this process. I hate asking questions, I always get tongue-tied and I'll probably forget what I want to say. Completing take-home assignments. In addition to in-class exercise, students have take-home assignments. They keep a stress diary in which they record what events they find stressful and how they respond to them. As they become proficient in identifying stressful incidents, they are encouraged to record the negative self-statements or irrational thoughts that accompany the stressful experience. Acquiring skills. The next stage of stress management involves skill acquisition and practice. These skills include cognitive behavioral management techniques, time management skills and other stress-reducing interventions such as exercise. Some of these techniques are designed to eliminate the stressful event, others are geared towards reducing the experience of stress without necessarily modifying the event. Setting new goals. Students next begin to attack their stressful events by setting goals, engaging in positive self-talk and using self-instruction. Each student first sets several specific goals that he or she wants to meet to reduce the experience of college stress. For one student, the goal may be learning to speak in class without suffering overwhelming anxiety. For another, it may be going to see a particular professor about a problem. Once the goals have been set, the next challenge is to identify specific behaviors that will meet those goals. In some cases, an appropriate response may be leaving the stressful event altogether. For example, the student who is having difficulty in a rigorous physics course may need to modify his goal of becoming a physicist. Alternatively, students may be encouraged to turn a stressor into a challenge. Thus, a student who fears speaking up in class may come to realize that she must not only master this fearful event, but actually come to enjoy it if she is to realize her long-term goal of becoming a trial lawyer. In other cases, students may have to put up with a stressful event by simply learn to manage it more effectively. If a particular English course is highly stressful but is required for graduation, the student must learn to cope with the course in the best way possible. Thus, goal setting is important in effective stress management for two reasons. First, it forces a person to distinguish among stressful events to be avoided, tolerated, or overcome. Second, it forces her or him to be specific and concrete about exactly which events need to be tackled and which is to be done. engaging in positive self-talk and self-instruction. Once students have set some realistic goals and identified some target behaviors for reaching their goals, they learn how to engage in self-instruction and positive self-talk, two skills that can help in achieving these goals. Self-instruction involves reminding oneself of specific steps that are required to achieve the goal. Positive self-talk involves providing the self with specific encouragement. For example, students desiring to overcome a fear of oral presentations might remind themselves of all the occasions in which they have spoken successfully in public. Once some proficiency in public speaking is achieved, students might encourage themselves by highlighting the positive aspects of the experience. For example, holding the attention of the audience, making some points, and winning over a few converts to their positions using other cognitive behavioral techniques. In some stress management programs, contingency contracting is encouraged. For example, students who have trouble getting motivated to make changes are encouraged to make a contract with the self. The student who fears making oral presentations may define a specific goal, such as asking 3 questions in class in a week, which is to be followed by a particular reward, such as tickets to a concert. To summarize, this program for controlling stress involves a wide array of cognitive behavioral therapy techniques: self-monitoring, the modification of internal dialogues, goal setting, homework assignment, positive self-talk, self-instruction, and contingency contracting. Most of stress management programs include varied array of techniques so that people have a broad set of skills from which to choose. People can discover the skills that work best for them. In these ways, people can inoculate themselves against stress, helping them to confront stressful events with a clear plan and an array of potential measures that they take before the stressful event becomes overwhelming. Self-affirmation. Self-related resources such as self-esteem can be important for helping people mobilize themselves to cope with stress. A technique that makes use of this insight is called self-affirmation. Self-affirmation theory maintains that when people positively affirm values and other personal qualities that are important to them, they may experience beneficial physiological and psychological responses. Self-affirmation may be one of the reasons why writing about or otherwise disclosing one's stressors is beneficial to health. That is, if during the writing process people are able to affirm their values and personal qualities, they may enhance the value of the writing intervention. Based on the observations such as these, researchers are now using self-affirmation as an intervention to help people cope with stress. Relaxation training and stress management. Whereas the techniques we have discussed so far give a person cognitive insights into the nature and control of stress, another set of techniques, relaxation training, affects the physiological experience of stress by reducing arousal. Relaxation training therapies include progressive muscle relaxation training, guided imagery, transcendental meditation, and other forms of meditation including yoga and hypnosis. What are the benefits? These techniques can reduce heart rate, muscle tension, blood pressure, inflammatory processes, lipid levels, self-reports of anxiety, and tension, among other physical and psychological benefits. Because of the value of relaxation for physical and mental health, most stress management interventions include relaxation therapy. First, people learn how to control their breathing, taking no more than 6 to 8 breaths per minute. They learn to relax the muscles in each part of the body progressively until they experience no tension, progressive muscle relaxation. They learn to identify the particular spots that tense up during times of stress, such as the jaw that clamps shut or fists that tighten up. By becoming aware of these reactions, they can relax these parts of the body as well. Thus, for example, When students find that the stress of college life is overwhelming them, they can take 5 or 10 minutes break in which they breathe deeply and relax completely. They then return to their task free of some of their previous tension. Related techniques such as yoga may also have health benefits. For example, one study found that people who regularly practiced yoga experienced more positive emotions and showed lower inflammatory responses to stress than those who were new to the practice of yoga. Yoga then may ameliorate the burden that stress places on an individual. Even joyful music can be a stress buster. Supplementary stress management skills. In addition to the basic cognitive and relaxation skills of stress management, many programs include supplementary skills. In many cases, the experiences of stress depends on feeling that one has too much to do in too little time. Consequently, many stress management programs include training in management and planning. Many stress management programs emphasize good health habits and social skills as additional techniques for the control of stress. These include good eating habits, exercise, assertiveness in social situations, and use of social support. Likewise, regular exercise reduces stress. At least 20 to 30 minutes of sustained exercise at least 3 times a week is widely encouraged for all the participants in the CSN program. Assertiveness training is sometimes incorporated into stress management. Often, people experience stress because they are unable to confront the people who contribute to their stress. For example, in the CSN program, students who have identified other individuals in their environment as causing them special stress, called stress carriers, help one another practice dealing with these individuals. One student may practice approaching a professor with whom he is having difficulty communicating. Another student may practice dealing tactfully with a roommate who constantly brags about how well she is doing in her classes. Social support can buffer the adverse effects of stress. Unfortunately, people under stress sometimes alienate rather than engage in those who might provide social support. For example, a harried worker snaps at his wife and children, or a student facing a big exam angrily rejects a friend's well-intentioned advice. Students in the CSN program are trained to recognize the important functions that social support can serve in helping them combat stress. They are urged to confide in close friends, to seek advice from people who can help them, and to use time with other people for relaxation and positive reinforcement after meeting their goals. In the final stage of CSN program, stress management techniques are put into effect. If some techniques fail to work, the trainees are urged to figure out why students take their experience of stress management back to the group situation, whereas successes and failures can be analyzed. If initial efforts to cope with the stressful event are unsuccessful, the student may need to practice a technique or shift to a different technique. Overall, the stress management training imparts valuable skills for living in a world with many sources of stress, and it improves mental and physical health as well. This brings us to the end of the lecture. Thanks for watching.